There's a line in the movie The Blues Brothers where an excited waitress says, "Music? We know music. We've got both kinds of music here, country and Western." Now, that was meant as a joke, but I have to tell you, anybody who's ever worked in a small town radio station knows that it is just so true. I grew up in the largest city in Australia, and then as a teenager moved to another capital city, and I had no experience of country music. And so when I got my first job in radio, it was inevitable that it would be on a country music show. You see, the thing about radio is that, like every job, the new kid always gets the job that nobody else wants. And in the case of 4LG Longreach, my first radio station, that was Ranch Club. 2 hours of country and Western request music. Now, these days I know the difference between country and Western. Then it was all just a mess. But the first songs that I ever played on the radio were an Australian cover version of the Cal Smith classic, "Daddy, I hope you'll forgive her. I'm sending this letter with love. I'm sending it airmail to heaven to your new home up above." Oh, it was dog's vomit. And it was followed by an Australian artist, Slim Dusty, real hillbilly stuff with "The biggest disappointment in the family was me." Well, I knew exactly how he felt at that point. The third song, this was a ribald little ditty by a local called Johnny Chester, "Lonely Women Make Good Lovers." Oh, yeah. The fact that I can still remember these three songs 40 years later probably tells you how deeply, deeply damaged my psyche was. But this is the thing about radio. The new kid gets the stuff that nobody wants. And that hasn't changed in the 40 years since I started. Something else that hasn't changed in the 40 years since I began in radio are funeral announcements. You see, in small country towns where the local newspaper might only come out once a week, people can die and be buried before their friends even know that they're gone. And so to fill the gap, radio stations play funeral announcements, normally at a peak time of the morning, and they'll go something like, "Ladies and gentlemen, we now pause to offer our condolences and deepest sympathy before reading the following funeral announcement. The relatives and friends of the late Fred Nurk are respectfully invited to attend his funeral, which will take place at St Zacchaeus the Tax Collector Church in Eagle Street, Longreach, at 2 p.m. this afternoon for interment in the Catholic section of the Longreach Cemetery." Now, while that was playing, there'd be this horrible, turgid, maudlin organ music, sort of like the Phantom of the Opera, but not the 80s, 90s version. No, we're talking the Claude Rains version of Phantom of the Opera. And then at the end of the funeral announcement, you'd fade that organ music, and then you'd leave a pause before you move to the next event. Which couldn't be a commercial, of course, because if you were an advertiser, would you want your commercial to be next to dead people? No. So it would have to be a song. I have to tell you, and these are all purely accidental, I have heard some, let's say, inappropriate songs played after funeral announcements. One of my favourites is the Bee Gees, "Wah, wah, 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 staying alive, staying alive." Up and away. Or worse still, "I fell into a burning ring of fire." They were terrible songs, and they were all chosen purely by accident. I never made that mistake. I didn't. But I came so very, very close once. I had just read a funeral announcement for this particularly crabby old biddy. You know, the sort of woman that people were only going to turn up to the funeral just to make sure that she was actually dead. You know the type. Well, I just read this funeral announcement for her, and I was perhaps half a second away from playing the record when I realised that the song that I had queued up this morning was "Ding Dong, the witch is dead, witch, oh witch, the wicked witch." Let's just say that it's slightly longer than normal pause that day while I frantically queued up something else. But I dodged that bullet. I have to say, I didn't dodge every bullet, though. One of the other things that happens with young radio announcers in small city stations is you tend to come along and have forgotten to bring dinner, for example. So you head down to the local cafe, or sometimes you just got to go to the bathroom, and so you put on a long record. My favourite was Creedence Clearwater Revival's Heard It Through the Grapevine. It ran 11 minutes and 43 seconds, the album version. And so I put it on and I went down to the Boomerang Cafe and I got my hamburger and I came back. And that about 30 seconds after I'd left the studio, it had hit a scratch. And so for 4.5 minutes, all the audience had heard was heard it through that, 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 heard it through that. Embarrassing, I have to say. But not as embarrassing as this one last story, which I'll tell you, which I think sums up small town radio. I was sitting there ready to read the news one morning at 7:30, peak time in breakfast. The breakfast announcer is sitting on the other side of the desk, and he introduced a song and he made a complete and utter dog's breakfast of it. It was terrible. And he threw off his headphones, and he looked at me and he went, bleep, I really bleeped that one up, didn't I? Well, I just pointed to the on-air light over his shoulder. He looked at it, looked back at me, went, oh, bleep, and then turned the microphone off. Now, I mentioned this story not to embarrass him, although I will tell you that he no longer works in radio. Last I heard, he was installing car radios in a suburb near me. But I tell you this to tell you this. We didn't get a single complaint that day. Not one. Not a phone call. Not a letter. Not an email. Well, we couldn't have got an email because they weren't emails in those days, but nothing, not even a telex to say that was a bad thing. Which means one of two things. Either nobody was listening, and at 7:30 on a weekday morning, that seems unlikely, or they thought, this is 4LG. This sort of stuff happens all the time. And quite frankly, I don't know which is more depressing.